أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Verily, our praise is due to Allah. We praise Him, we seek His aid, and we ask for His forgiveness. We seek refuge in Allah from the evils of our own selves and from the evils of our own actions. And whomsoever Allah guides, none can misguide. And whomsoever Allah leaves astray, none can guide back to the correct path. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan abduhu wa rasuluhu, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We testify there is no deity worthy of our worship except for Allah, who is alone, no partnership, that never has and never will be another. And we bear witness that Muhammad, peace and blessing be upon him, is the last and the final prophet of Allah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, brothers and sisters, friends and family, everybody tuning in to the live stream, everybody joining us in the Zoom meeting. Just like for joining us again for the Sunday discussion, where we will be continuing the reading of When the Moon Split, a biography of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, by Safiur Rahman Mubarakpuri. Last week, we had left off before the entrance of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam into Mecca, where we had left off at the bottom of or midway through page 251. So let's go ahead and continue. Bismillah. That same morning, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam left his camp for Mecca. He instructed Abbas to take Abu Sufyan to a hill at the end of the valley where he could review the Muslim troops on the march. Abbas obeyed the Prophet ﷺ's instruction and took Abu Sufyan to observe the Muslim army that surged like an ocean in front of him. And different tribes marched by Abu Sufyan with their tribal colors, and as each marched ahead, he asked Abbas the name of the tribe. When he was told the name of the tribe, he mumbled gloomily, "What have I to do with them?" Then came the detachment of the Ansar with Sa'ad bin Ubaidah holding the standard. Sa'ad passed by Abu Sufyan and called out, "Abu Sufyan, today is a day of conflict and bloodshed. Today the Kaaba will be made lawful for us." So Abu Sufyan said, "Oh Abbas, congratulations on the day of destruction and plunder." So how kind, I'm sorry. Finally, the Prophet ﷺ himself passed by, flanked by the Muhajirin, and the Ansar, who were completely covered in armor save for their eyes. And Abu Sufyan sighed and said, "Abbas, who are these?" And when Abbas told him that it was the Prophet ﷺ approaching, accompanied by the Ansar and the Muhajirin, Abu Sufyan said, "Who has the power to resist them? The empire of your nephew has assumed splendid proportions." And Abbas said, "Such is prophethood." And Abu Sufyan said in resignation, "Yes, of course." Abu Sufyan took Sa'ad's challenge very seriously, and he went to the Prophet ﷺ and repeated what Sa'ad had said. And the Prophet ﷺ was displeased with Sa'ad's bragging and replied, "Nay, the Kaaba will be raised in honor today. The Kaaba will be clothed today." In saying this, the Prophet ﷺ took the standard from Sa'ad and gave it to his son, Qiyas, and he was worried that in the euphoria of victory, Sa'ad might unleash terror on the citizens of Mecca. And as the Prophet ﷺ had passed away, Abu Sufyan hurried back to Mecca and announced loudly, "O people of Quraysh, this is Muhammad, who has come to you with an army who cannot resist. Now he who enters Abu Sufyan's house will be safe." "Allah destroy you," cried some of the Quraysh in dismay. "How can your house accommodate us all?" And Abu Sufyan then added, "He who shuts his door upon himself will also be safe, just as he who enters the sacred mosque will be safe." And at that, the people dispersed to take shelter in their houses and in the Kaaba. And when the Prophet ﷺ arrived at Dhul, he ordered Khalid bin Walid and the left flank of the army to enter the lower part of the Mecca via Kedah. And anyone among the Quraysh who resisted was to be killed, and the army was to proceed and meet up with the Prophet at Mount Safa. And the Prophet ﷺ's standard bearer and commander of the right wing, Zubair, was commanded to make his entry into Mecca through the upper part of Kedah and to pitch his standard at Haijun. And he and the troops were to stay there until the arrival of the Prophet ﷺ. And Abu Ubaidah, the commander of the infantry and the unarmed soldiers, was to go along the route leading from inside the valley and to descend into Mecca ahead of the Prophet. So at this stage, the Quraysh assembled some of their men under Sufyan ibn Umayyah, Ikrama Abi Jahl, and Sahal ibn Amr at Faydama and entrusted them with the last vestige of resistance against that advancing Muslim army. And if they too fell, it was no choice but to accept the Muslim supremacy over Mecca. And indeed, that day there was no choice before the Quraysh but to accept Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. And after nearly 21 years of patience and endurance of persecution, Allah's Messenger, Sallallahu would finally enter his sacred mosque victorious and unchallenged. So Khalid and his men passed the company and made short work of the Meccan resistance. 12 of the pagans were killed, and the rest took to their heels. And once he had dismissed the contingent, no barriers remained in Khalid's way. And he and his men charged into Mecca, marching through the streets and by lanes without any opposition. And 2 men who got separated from them were killed. Finally, at Safa, Khalid and his men met up with the Prophet Sallallahu. Zubair, on the other hand, arrived at Hejun and planted his standard near Fath Mosque, and he put a tent there for Salama and Maymuna, and in compliance with the Prophet ﷺ's instructed, he waited for the Prophet ﷺ to arrive there. And when the Prophet ﷺ had gotten there, he rested briefly and then moved forward, accompanied by Abu Bakr. And at last, the moment ordained by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had arrived, and his servant was finally free to worship him without impediment. Humble in victory, flanked by his followers, the Prophet ﷺ entered the sacred mosque, reciting Surat al-Fath. He then kissed the black stone, circumambulated the Kaaba, and around it were 360 idols that the pagans had placed over the years. He prodded each with a stick in his hand, reciting the following 2 verses, Surah 17, Ayat 81. Truth has come and falsehood has vanished. Truly, falsehood is ever bound to vanish. And the truth has arrived, and falsehood can neither prove nor disprove anything. Surah 34, Ayat 49. So, thus, the Kaaba is then purified. So after the Prophet ﷺ had circled the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sent out for Uthman bin Talha, who held the keys of the Kaaba. He took the keys from Uthman and had the doors, and all the pictures rubbed out. And following this, the Prophet ﷺ entered the structure with Usama bin Zayd and Bilal and shut the door. He then faced the front wall and stood at a distance of 3 cubits thereof, and keeping 1 pillar on his left, 2 on the right, and 3 at the rear, offered 2 rakat in prayer. He then went round the sacred mosque, praising and glorifying Allah. So no fear this day. The Prophet ﷺ then opened the door of the Kaaba, and then the area around the Kaaba was packed with the Quraysh, who apprehensively awaited his next step. The Prophet ﷺ stood at the door of the Kaaba, holding its frame, while the Quraysh arrayed themselves in front of him. And to his old persecutors, humbled thus before him, he spoke at length as he explained several injunctions of Islam and annulled all pagan practices. He then asked the Quraysh, "O Quraysh, what do you think I am about to do with you?" And they replied, saying, "We hope for the best. You are a noble brother and the son of a noble brother." The Prophet ﷺ said, "Simply have no fear this day. Go your way, for you are all free." The Prophet ﷺ descended and he sat in the sacred mosque. He then returned the keys to Uthman bin Talha and said, "The key shall remain with you, but none but a tyrant would take it from you." So thus then the Quraysh take a pledge of allegiance. The Prophet ﷺ then climbed Mount Safa until he could see the Kaaba. He then raised his hands in prayer, and when he had finished, the people came up to confess their faith and pledge their allegiance. And among those who became Muslim that day was Abu Quhafa, the father of the dear companion Abu Bakr, and the Prophet ﷺ expressed great joy at his conversion. Women also came up and asked to be admitted into Islam, and the Prophet ﷺ administered the following oath to them without shaking their hands: "Pledge that you will not associate anything with Allah, steal, commit adultery, kill your children, slander anyone, nor disobey me." And among the women who took the oath of allegiance that day was Hind bin Utbah, wife of Abu Sufyan. She came veiled and in disguise as she feared for her life. And what she had done to the dead body of Hamza had been unforgivable, and the fear of retribution gnawed at her. And after taking the oath, she said, "O Messenger of Allah, there's no tent on my face of the earth more detested by me than yours, but now your tent is dearest of all to me." And thereupon the Prophet ﷺ remarked, by the one in whose hand lies the life of Muhammad, it is so. And Umar bin Khattab sat below the Prophet ﷺ's seat, relaying the Prophet's words to the people and administering the oath of allegiance on behalf of the Prophet. And some people came up to pledge their willingness to migrate for the sake of Islam. But the Prophet ﷺ said, the Muhajirin have garnered all the reward of hijrah, migration for the sake of Allah. Now that Mecca has been conquered, there can be no migration, no more migration. However, jihad remains open to you, and so does the intention to make jihad. When you are called upon to fight in Allah's way, go forth. So next is the death of the criminals. So the general amnesty notwithstanding, the Prophet ﷺ sentenced the worst criminals to death that day and issued orders to kill them, even if they were found clinging to the covering of the Kaaba. Allah's wrath had finally descended upon them, and the vast earth appeared constricted as they faced retribution. However, it is also illuminating to reflect that of all the population of Mecca who had waged war against Islam, only 4 people were killed that day, and they were Ibn Khattal, Muqis bin Sababa, Harith bin Nufail, and one of the maids of Ibn Khattal. Some sources say that Harith bin Talat al-Huzai and Sa'ad were also slain, but it is thought that Sa'ad was none other than the maid of Ibn Khattal. Thus, no more than 6 were punished by death. 4 others escaped death. They fled or hid and returned to embrace Islam once they were guaranteed a pardon, and they were Abdullah bin Sa'ad bin Abi Sahr, Ikrama bin Abu Jahal, Habar bin Aswad, and another maid of Ibn Khattal. And some sources add the names of Ka'ab bin Zuhair, Wahshi bin Harb, and Hind bin Utbah, the wife of Abu Sufyan, bringing the number to 7 persons in all. And some others from the Quraysh, such as Safwan bin Umayyah, Zuhair bin Abu Umayyah, and Suhail bin Amr, hid themselves, even though they were not condemned to death. Subsequently, they all embraced Islam. And next is the prayer of victory. At mid-morning, the Prophet ﷺ entered the house of his cousin, Hani bint Abu Talib, where he bathed and prayed 8 rakats in units of 2 each. In the same house covered the 2 pagan brothers-in-law of Hani. And when Ali found out that the sisters were shielding him, he immediately wanted to kill them. But Hani went to the Prophet ﷺ, who said to her, I grant refuge to whomever you have given refuge. Next, Bilal calls the adhan from the Kaaba. And when it was time for the Dhuhr prayer, the Prophet ﷺ asked Bilal to call the adhan from the roof of the Kaaba as a proclamation of the dominance of Islam. How pleasing to Muslim ears and how loathsome to the polytheists it was to hear the declaration of Allah's supremacy in his sacred house. And next, the Prophet in Mecca. So when the conquest of Mecca was complete, the Ansar grew worried that the Prophet ﷺ would stay in Mecca, home of the ancestors of his ancestors and his tribe, and they expressed their concern to the Prophet ﷺ as he stood with his hands raised in prayer on Mount Safa. And after his prayer was over, he allayed their fears. Allah forbid that I should do so. I will live and die with you. So the Prophet ﷺ stayed for 19 days in Mecca, during which period he obliterated every vestige of Jahiliyyah, the age of ignorance that had preceded Islam. Mecca became an Islamic city. The Prophet ﷺ erected pillars to demarcate the boundaries of the sacred mosque. Following this, a crier announced that whoever believed in Allah and the hereafter was to destroy any idol that remained in his house. And Uzza, Suwa, and Mana are destroyed. On the 25th of Ramadan, the Prophet ﷺ dispatched Khalid bin Walid to Nakhala at the head of the 30 cavalrymen to destroy or demolish the temple of Uzza. The idol of Uzza was the biggest, and Khalid smashed it to pieces. In the same month, Amr bin As was sent to demolish the idol of Suwa, the chief deity of Banu Hudayl, and Amr arrived at the shrine of Rabat, 150 kilometers northeast of Mecca, and razed it to the ground. And his priest saw the inanimate object submit itself to destruction, and he was overcome with the realization that no creator could be destroyed thus. So one more false god remained, and the Prophet ﷺ sent Sa'ad bin Zayd Ashhali at the head of 20 cavaliers to destroy Mena, the deity of Kalb, Huzza, Ghassan, Aus, and Khazraj tribes, and Sa'ad broke the idols and demolished its temple, removing one more loathed rival of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the one, the eternal, of whom no likeness can never be made. So next, Khalid is sent to Banu Dutaima. So realizing that they need to instill Islam in the hearts of many people as possible, the Prophet ﷺ sent Khalid bin Walid to Banu Judaima in the month of Shawwal to preach Islam, and he was accompanied by 300 men of the Muhajirin, Ansar, and Banu Sulaim. And when Banu Judaima were invited to accept Islam, they cried, Sabana, Sabana, we have left our religion, we have left our religion. And their answer reeked of deceit to Khalid, who rounded them up and killed some of them. And later he ordered every Muslim soldier to kill his captives, but Ibn Omar and his comrades refused to carry out such an unjust order. And on their return, the dissenters placed the matter before the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ, horrified at what Khalid had done, prayed with his hands raised, "Oh Allah, do not hold me to account for Khalid's act." He then sent Ali to Banu Judaima, to pay blood money to the relatives of those slain and to compensate those whose property had been destroyed, and the money that was left over after payment of compensation was also left with the tribe. And Khalid's actions during the expedition earned him criticism from several of the Prophet ﷺ's companions, and there were angry exchanges between him and Abdul Rahman bin Auf. And when the altercation was reported to the Prophet ﷺ, he had said, Khalid, refrain from saying anything harsh to my companions. By Allah, if Mount Uhud turned into gold and you were to spend it in the way of Allah, even then you would not equal the morning or evening prayer of any one of my companions. So next is the Battle of Hunain. So the conquest of Mecca had silenced its citizens, but neighboring tribes clamored for a confrontation. Qiyas Milan assembled for consultation with Banu Thaqif and Banu Hawazin in the forefront, and they said amongst themselves, as Muhammad SAW has already won the war against his people, none remains to prevent him from fighting against us. Why should we not take the initiative? So accordingly, they decided to fight and mustered a large army under Malik bin Auf Nasari, and they came down to Utaz, their women, their children, and livestock with them, and an old veteran, Durayed bin Sima, who was highly reputed in the art of warfare, accompanied the Hawazin army. And when Durayed heard the groaning camels, the braying asses, the bleating sheep and goats, and the crying children, he asked Malik to explain their presence in the army. And Malik replied that each member of the army was to be followed by his family and material possessions so that each man would fight fiercely to defend them. And Durayed said, by God, you are a shepherd who can block the way of the deserter. Behold, if you win the battle, it is you alone who will be the winners with your swords and spears, and if you are defeated, you will be disgraced in front of your families. Then he advised Malik to send the non-combatants back home, and the latter refused. He assembled the women, the children, and the livestock to Utaz, while he himself proceeded to the neighboring valley of Hunain with the troops and lay in ambush. And when informed of the developments, the Prophet ﷺ marched on the head of the 12,000 soldiers from Mecca on Saturday, Shawwal, the sixth day of Shawwal, 8 years after the Hijrah. He took 1,000 coats of mail and other weaponry from Safwan bin Umayyah on credit, and the administration of Mecca was entrusted to Uqab bin Usayd. And on the way, the troops came across a big tree named That al-Anwat, and was a shrine to the pagan deity of war, and from its branches the pagan Arabs suspended their weapons, offered sacrifices beneath it, and performed some rites of propitiation. And some people who had not quite grasped the essence of Islam beseeched the Prophet, saying, make us that al-Anwat similar to theirs. And the Prophet ﷺ replied, Allah is the most great. You have said what the people of Musa said to him. Surah 7, Ayat 138, fashion for us a God similar to their gods. Musa replied, you are an ignorant people. And the Prophet ﷺ then added, verily, you will follow every custom of the people before you. So the Muslims exuded overconfidence because of their great strength, and some even exulted exalted, so they could not be defeated by for want of numbers, and the Prophet ﷺ grew displeased at this arrogance. And when the evening had set in, the cavalier brought the news that Banu Hawazin had come out along with their children, their women, their camels, and goats. And the Prophet ﷺ smiled and remarked, saying, Insha'Allah, all of these will become the spoils of war for the Muslims. And on the 10th day of Shawwal, the Prophet ﷺ reached Hunayn, and before descending the valley at dawn, the Prophet ﷺ arrayed the troops, and he gave the standard to the Muhajirin of Ali bin Abi Talib, the standards of Aus to Usayd bin Hudayr, and that of the Khawarij to Hubab bin Mundhir, and each clan had its standard bearer. And the Prophet ﷺ himself wore a double coat of arms and a helmet covering his head and face. The vanguard then began to descend the valley, unaware of the enemy troops lying in wait. And the Muslim soldiers were still in the process of descending when the enemy troops sprang up like a swarm of locusts, and the onslaught forced the Muslim flanks to fall back, and they fled in terror, each unheeding of the other. Those in the rear followed suit, and a complete rout of the Muslims was in sight. And this turn of events gladdened the hearts of the polytheists and the token converts to Islam. Abu Sufyan remarked, there the Muslims' flight will not stop until they reach the sea. And Kilda, one of Safwan's brothers, rejoiced, the spell of their sorcery has ended today. Another brother said, receive the glad tidings of the defeat of Muhammad and his followers. He will never be able to unite them. And Safwan, although a polytheist, chided those who mocked the Muslims by saying, by God, I would rather be defeated by a man from the Quraysh than a man from the Hawazin. And while his troops scattered in confusion, the Prophet ﷺ remained steadfast on the battlefield. He pressed ahead, spurring his mule, and declared, verily, I am the true prophet. I am the son of Abdul Muttalib. And Abu Sufyan bin Harith was holding the bridle of his mule. Al-Abbas was holding the stirrup, trying to keep the Prophet ﷺ from advancing towards the enemy too swiftly. And the Prophet ﷺ then dismounted and prayed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, seeking his help, and then he instructed Abbas, who had a booming voice, to call his companions. Abbas called out, O comrades of the tree, those who took the pledge of Ridwan, where are you? And all of those who heard the cry were compelled to turn, and they called back, here we are. And numbering about 100, they rushed purposefully towards the resounding voice, and reinforced thus, the Prophet ﷺ bore down upon the enemy, and a new battle between two parties had started. And a call was then given to the Ansar, and then to Banu Harith bin Khawarij, and the Muslim squadrons returned to the valley one after another. Peace descended upon the Prophet ﷺ and the believers, and an unforeseen army fought side by side with the Muslims, who began to fight with fresh resolve. And the Prophet ﷺ took a handful of dust and threw it at his enemies, saying, may their faces be disfigured. And at this the enemy's eyes were stung from the dust, and this was from the moment they became confused and helpless, and in disarray they fled the battlefield. And the Muslim army pursued their terrified enemies, killing some and capturing others with ease. And along with the captured soldiers, the Muslims also rounded up the women and the children of their enemies. And only moments before, the Muslims had appeared to be on the verge of defeat, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reunited them and endowed them with victory. And witnessing the Prophet ﷺ's miraculous triumph, many pagans then embraced Islam. So 3 groups of pagan soldiers managed to then escape, the largest group fleeing to Ta'if, another group to Nakhla, and a third group barricaded themselves in Utas. And the Prophet ﷺ sent Abu Amir Ashari, the uncle of Abu Musa Ashari, to Utas at the head of the squadron, and he successfully dispersed the enemy before being martyred. And Abu Musa Ashari then took over and led the squadron back with the spoils that they had won. And another squadron went on to Nakhla in pursuit of the second group of pagans, and they were captured, and there they had captured Durayd bin Sima and killed him. And at the end of the fight, the Prophet ﷺ asked his men to pile all of the spoils of the battle into one spot. And when everything was gathered, the spoils amounted to 24,000 camels, 40,000 or more goats, 160,000 dirhams worth of silver, and 6,000 women and children. And the Prophet ﷺ ordered everything to be taken to Jirana, and he appointed Muad bin Amr Ghafari to oversee the process. And SubhanAllah. I think we are in good measure for today, inshallah. Let's stop here at page 263, and we will continue in the following week. Just like an item for everybody tuning in, and I hope to see you then. Allahumma subhanahu wa bihamdi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa ant, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilaik. Assalamu alaikum wa